To find liberation from the chains of endless emotional pain, one must grasp a harsh, yet often overlooked, truth. The source of suffering lies not in the events of life themselves, but in a deep-seated resistance to what is. The vast majority of people live their lives without ever comprehending this fundamental wisdom. They remain prisoners of ceaseless inner turmoil, reliving the same torments repeatedly, completely unaware that their own rejection sustains and fuels this suffering. The profound insight of Carl Jung, one of the most brilliant minds in psychology, is encapsulated in one of his most piercing quotes: "What you resist persists." This is not merely an elegant phrase designed to embellish speech. It is a profound psychological and spiritual axiom with the potential to completely transform a person's existence. Take a moment to consider the depth of this thought and allow it to permeate your very being. When something truly painful occurs in a person's life, be it job loss, a painful breakup, betrayal by a loved one, or a crushing failure, their initial emotional reaction is perfectly natural. In such moments, one might feel deep sadness, burning anger, overwhelming disappointment, paralyzing fear, or agonizing confusion. All these experiences are absolutely permissible and inherent manifestations of human nature, and in themselves they do not cause prolonged suffering. However, there is a profound misconception regarding the nature of suffering. The agonizing experience that engulfs a person does not stem from the event itself. Its true source lies in the individual's internal struggle with reality. It arises from that inner voice in the mind that persistently whispers, "This shouldn't have happened. This is completely unfair. I can't live with this." It is this internal resistance, this fundamental refusal to accept the existing state of affairs, that transforms fleeting pain into an exhausting and prolonged torment. This is the true root of suffering. As is well known, the human mind inherently strives for complete control over the surrounding world. People yearn for life to unfold strictly according to their own script, seeking to avoid any discomfort at all costs. They seek predictability, stability, and unwavering certainty. However, existence does not conform to an individual's personal preferences. It does not follow our rules or fit into preconceived frameworks. Life moves according to its own, often mysterious and unpredictable rhythm. What happens when reality challenges our expectations? When events unfold differently than planned, the natural human instinct is to resist, fight, and deny what has occurred. In such moments, the mind exclaims, "This shouldn't have happened to me." And it is precisely at this very instant of mental rebellion against objective reality that suffering is born. Consider, for example, a relationship breakup. The natural grief caused by the loss of a loved one may well last days, weeks, or in some cases even several months. But the suffering that lasts for years, that deep, soul-tormenting pain, arises not from the loss itself, but from a categorical refusal to accept what happened, from stubbornly clinging to the past, from endlessly replaying memories, and from an unwavering belief that everything should have turned out completely differently. The individual is not broken by the fact of loss itself. They are undermined by their refusal to let go of what has already become part of the past. The same principle applies to experiences related to betrayal, failure, rejection, or any other form of loss. The event itself will not break a person. What breaks them is the relentless mental resistance to accepting what has already happened and is undeniable reality. The question arises, how can this destructive cycle, which so often shackles human life, be broken? The answer, it is asserted, is hidden in a profound spiritual principle that, when fully understood and embraced, has the potential to transform an individual's entire reality. This is radical acceptance. It is important to clarify the understanding of this term. Acceptance by no means implies resignation to circumstances or passive consent. It does not mean that one must like what happened, and certainly not that one must approve of a situation that may have caused significant pain. The essence of acceptance lies in ceasing the futile struggle with reality. The individual stops pouring their precious energy into a losing battle against what has already occurred. They stop stubbornly resisting the existing state of affairs. Instead, the same energy that was previously expended on useless opposition is consciously redirected to the only area where a person truly has genuine power, their own reaction to what has happened. And then when an individual finally achieves this state of genuine acceptance of what has occurred, when they truly, consciously agree with reality, something truly astonishing begins to happen. The unbearable weight that previously pressed down gradually dissipates. This is not because the pain miraculously disappears or vanishes without a trace, but because the person ceases to actively feed it. They no longer sustain the suffering with their stubborn resistance and denial. For illustration, imagine a person who has recently been laid off from work. If they continue to cling to anger, constantly blame others, and maintain the conviction of the blatant injustice of what happened, they risk remaining in this state of deep pain for many years, harboring resentment towards their former company, feeling like an innocent victim and carrying this unhealed wound into every subsequent workplace. However, if instead they make a conscious decision to accept what happened and ask themselves, "What can I do about this?" they reclaim their inner power and control over the situation. Such a person stops living in a state of constant reaction to external stimuli and begins to act, guided by their own intention. As a result, pain ceases to be a destructive factor and transforms into a powerful catalyst for personal growth. This is where the main riddle is solved. The entire essence, it turns out, boils down to the individual's personal perception. Carl Jung, a distinguished thinker, repeatedly emphasized the fundamental importance of integrating all aspects of human experience, including those that seem to be dark and uncomfortable. He asserted that pain, when met with readiness rather than rejection, is capable of transforming into profound understanding. A common misconception, which perhaps everyone makes at some point on their journey, is the belief that one's own suffering is unique. It seems as though no one else can truly comprehend the depth of the difficulties experienced, and that one's own pain is somehow more unbearable than the trials others have faced. However, the truth is that pain is an inherent and universal part of human existence. Suffering is alien to no one. What distinguishes those who steadily develop from those who remain stagnant lies not in the quantity of pain experienced, but in their attitude towards it. Individuals who resist pain are condemned to suffer, while those who accept it gain the opportunity for personal growth. If a person sincerely strives for healing and genuine freedom, the first step on this path must be to cease the internal struggle with the reality of life. It is necessary to accept what has already happened, to come to terms with what cannot be changed, and to acknowledge the existing state of affairs. Only after this should one focus all their energy on what is within their control and subject to transformation. There is one insight rarely mentioned in the context of liberation from suffering. The most striking realization is that a significant portion of this suffering never originated from the event itself. The source of pain often lies in how tightly one clung to it. For example, when a relationship ended and deep grief lasted for years, the reason was not only the breakup itself, but also the refusal to let go of the situation. In the case of betrayal that prevented moving forward, it was not only the act of perfidy, but also the attachment to resentment. When a missed opportunity caused a feeling of stagnation in life, it was not only a consequence of the missed chance, but also an obsession with what could have happened. When a person finally releases internal resistance, when they stop stubbornly fighting with the surrounding reality, the oppressive suffering begins to gradually weaken and dissolve. This does not mean that the feeling of pain instantly disappears overnight, but it significantly loses its dominant influence over the individual. And over time, this pain transforms, turning from a constant and heavy burden into a valuable life lesson. Now, let's move to a more fundamental aspect that the vast majority of people don't even tend to consider: how a person's unconscious locks them into a trap of chronic suffering. Because once one realizes that suffering stems from internal resistance, the next logical question immediately arises. If this understanding has been achieved, why does a person repeatedly return to the same destructive emotional patterns? And this is where the turning point lies. Because once the carefully hidden answer to this crucial question is discovered, one will comprehend something astonishing and significant. They have significantly more control over their own life than they ever could have imagined. Let's start with an uncomfortable truth. A person's unconscious is, in essence, programmed to cyclically reproduce suffering. If anyone has ever felt that pain arises seemingly out of nowhere in their life, that suffering is some kind of unlucky streak that follows them everywhere. Then it's time to grasp the truth that very few dare to voice. The reality is that it is the person themselves who repeatedly reproduces their painful experience without even realizing it. And this does not happen because they seek to suffer, but because their unconscious programming inexorably pulls them into the same emotional traps and cycles. The renowned psychologist Carl Jung expressed this idea in one of his most profound and provocative statements, succinctly declaring, "Until you make the unconscious conscious, it will direct your life and you will call it fate." In Jung's understanding, the suffering that a person constantly experiences is by no means accidental. It is by no means evidence that universal forces are punishing them, or that life is inherently cruel for no reason. Such a state of affairs does not mean that the individual is doomed to failure, unhappy, or cursed by some higher powers. The reason lies in the fact that deep within, in the most hidden corners of the subconscious, there are stable emotional and mental patterns that are reproduced automatically. The individual experiences them again and again not by their own will, but because these patterns are painfully familiar. They are firmly integrated into the individual's internal system. The unconscious can be likened to hidden software that was installed in early childhood. And if a person developed in conditions where expressions of tenderness and affection were inevitably accompanied by pain, where the feeling of abandonment was perceived as normal, or where a sense of security was never guaranteed, then precisely these beliefs became their deep emotional blueprint. They were not consciously chosen. On the contrary, they were absorbed, imprinted in the psyche, and now they determine the course of events. No one usually explains this mechanism. The unconscious itself does not care about a person's happiness. Its only concern is to preserve what is familiar and habitual. This is why, even when an individual's conscious mind seeks to avoid suffering, a deeper part of their being continues to attract the same people, the same situations, and leads to the same emotional outcomes. This is not a mere coincidence, but a clearly expressed pattern. It is an invisible trap set by the unconscious. Have people ever noticed how they invariably become involved in relationships that inevitably bring them suffering? Have they ever experienced moments of true joy or significant success, only to somehow undermine these achievements or suddenly lose them? Do they constantly encounter the same difficulties, even when they firmly promise themselves that this time everything will be different? Such phenomena are by no means a consequence of bad luck or a fateful turn of events. They are merely a manifestation of how the deep subconscious reproduces the behavioral and reaction patterns it has already learned. In essence, this is nothing less than emotional self-sabotage in action. But a legitimate question arises: why does a person consciously or unconsciously choose what destroys them? The answer to this paradox lies in what was learned in early childhood. If, during their development, a person learned love as something inextricably linked with pain or a feeling of abandonment, then, upon reaching adulthood, they will unconsciously strive to form relationships that accurately recreate this familiar emotional experience. This happens not because the person desires suffering, but because precisely such an interpretation of love is understandable to their nervous system. It is perceived as something habitual, familiar. And in the bizarre, sometimes distorted logic of the human mind, familiar is equated with safe, even if it is accompanied by unbearable pain. If in their youth a person experienced deep rejection, humiliation, or neglect, then in the present they may unconsciously avoid new opportunities, potential relationships, or the pursuit of cherished dreams. This is due to the fact that some part of them is gripped by the fear of repeating the same pain. As a result, they may prefer to remain in a seemingly safe zone, even if it means staying in an endless cycle of suffering. And here is the truth that hurts the most. Until a person becomes aware of these deep-seated behavioral patterns, they will repeat them again and again throughout their life, and they will mistakenly call it fate. They will ask themselves questions that sound something like, why do I always end up with the same type of person? Why does my life never truly change? Why does everything always go wrong for me? But the real truth is that it is not life that is playing against them. It is not predetermined fate. It is not the universe working against their wishes. In reality, it is the person themselves reproducing the script that was deeply imprinted in their subconscious long ago. So the question arises, how does one break this unconscious pattern of emotional torment? Here is the core principle. A person cannot change what remains invisible to them. If there is a genuine desire to end the recurring cycle of emotional pain, the very first and decisive step is to become aware of the pattern by which the individual has unconsciously built their life. It must be brought out of the shadows, made explicit. To do this, one should start by asking themselves some deeply honest questions. For example, what emotion has been dominant in my life? Rejection, abandonment, betrayal, disappointment, fear. What relationships or situations do I constantly attract? What story do I tell myself about who I am and what the world is? When a person honestly answers these questions, something incredible happens. They begin to realize that the suffering they experienced did not come from outside, but from within themselves. The individual projected it onto the world again and again, completely unaware of it. And it is at this culminating moment that true transformation begins. Ending this recurring cycle of emotional pain does not mean that a person will never again feel sadness, anger, or disappointment. These emotions are undoubtedly an integral part of human existence. However, it means that they will no longer be held hostage by a hidden pattern that controlled them without their knowledge, because the moment a person becomes aware of their subconscious programming, they cease to be its obedient servant. It is impossible to completely avoid all life's adversities and pain. However, one can stop constantly reproducing it, stubbornly maintaining its existence. One can stop unconsciously preferring it without even realizing it. From this moment on, conscious choice begins, not a mechanical reaction on autopilot. The discourse often turns to the concept of the ego. This internal construct, as is well known, feeds on human suffering. It relentlessly sustains its pain. If a person sincerely strives to free themselves from the emotional patterns that continue to cause them discomfort, then they must grasp one vitally important truth. Their own ego is the greatest obstacle on the path to complete healing. The ego represents that inner voice that convinces the individual of their absolute right to feel wronged, of the injustice of the world, that others must change before they can find happiness. It persistently tells stories like, I am always a victim, or nothing ever works out for me. However, there is a harsh reality. The ego absolutely does not desire a person's healing. The reason is simple. If the individual healed, if they truly let go of their suffering, the ego would immediately lose its identity. It would simply have nothing left to feed on. The ego thrives in an atmosphere of conflict, on accusations, on judgment, on maintaining the illusion of separation between people. It masterfully creates drama, the sole purpose of which is to ensure its own existence. It instills the belief that a person's pain is irrefutable proof of their righteousness, and that the world, on the contrary, is wrong, that the individual is completely justified in their indignation, and that they must hold tightly to their old wounds. And nevertheless, when a person begins to perceive the ego for what it truly is, a psychological defense mechanism, an artfully crafted mask, a survival strategy, they gain the ability to begin disarming it. They can begin to penetrate into a deeper version of themselves, one that no longer needs to cling to pain to feel its reality, one that does not need to repeat past patterns to feel safe. For the truth is that healing is not a process of becoming someone completely different. It is, in essence, remembering who one was before the world began to dictate who to be. The famous psychoanalyst Carl Jung once uttered a wise observation. The mind that creates the problem is not the mind that can solve it. This aphorism contains a profound truth that sheds light on the very nature of human suffering. For the instance within a person that gave rise to emotional pain is, by its very nature, incapable of healing it. This instance, as is known, is called the ego. The ego, however, is more than just an internal monologue or a voice in the mind. It acts as an overarching filter through which the individual perceives all surrounding reality and themselves. Unfortunately, it is this very structure, the ego, that has been the root cause of much emotional torment. Consequently, when a person attempts to heal while remaining within an egoistic worldview, they only exacerbate the very suffering they seek to escape. But how can egoistic attitudes so cunningly undermine the process of emotional recovery? The ego demonstrates astonishing cunning and evasiveness in its manifestations. It never states directly, "My goal is to cause you suffering." On the contrary, it skillfully whispers very convincing arguments and rationales, inclining a person to continue clinging to their pain. The ego relentlessly, again and again, brings the mind back to memories of all the injustices experienced, betrayal by loved ones, the cruelty of fate, abandonment and loneliness, how other people left them in difficult times. It endlessly replays these painful episodes like a looping film, convincing the person that constantly and obsessively chewing on these thoughts somehow empowers them or gives them control. However, in reality, such mental rumination only holds the individual more tightly captive, trapped in an endless cycle of suffering in that very emotional prison whose walls the ego itself has built. One of the most insidious and dangerous tactics the human ego employs is its ability to induce an individual to completely identify with their suffering. It cunningly suggests that the pain experienced is the person's true essence. Imperceptibly, the individual begins to define their self through the prism of past wounds and traumas. Characteristic statements appear such as, "I am always betrayed," "People constantly leave me," "This happens to me again and again." And each time such thoughts are formed or spoken aloud, they only more deeply imprint this false identity into the psyche, strengthening its foundations. Thus, a person unconsciously develops a kind of devotion to their own torments. Furthermore, the ego will persistently try to convince the individual that the source of all problems lies outside themselves. It suggests that pain is exclusively someone else's fault, that life owes the person some unpaid debt, and that circumstances must change before they can feel well again. This is truly an ideal, sophisticated trap, for if the supposed solution always lies externally, then the person will never have to take personal responsibility for their own healing. They remain in a permanent state of waiting for apologies, for justice to be restored, or for someone to come and save them. And as long as this waiting continues, development stops, movement ceases. The person finds themselves trapped, firmly stuck in their state. You see, the ego constantly draws its strength from conflicts, from endless comparisons, and from old emotional wounds that, seemingly, never fully heal. This is because the ego itself continues to poke at them, giving them no rest until they bleed again. It thrives and strengthens when a person dwells on what went wrong, sinking into thoughts of failures. It keeps them in an endless cycle of self-pity, deep resentment, and constant blame. The ego convinces a person that they are completely powerless in the face of circumstances. It is here that the insidious victim trap begins to form. One of the most sophisticated and harmful methods by which the ego fixes an individual in a state of powerlessness is by imposing a victim identity on them. When a person sinks into a state of victimhood, they begin to sincerely believe that all adversities and troubles that befall them are the result of others' machinations, bad luck, or merciless blows of fate. And although it may mistakenly seem to them that they are thus protecting themselves by blaming the outside world for their troubles, in reality they are effectively renouncing their own inner power. For if an individual is convinced that they have no power over the course of their life, they will never decide on the necessary transformations to change it. And this is precisely what the ego craves, to keep them in a state of insignificance, defenselessness, and permanent suffering. However, there is an undeniable and very harsh truth. No one will come to save a person from the outside. No matter how many tears they shed, how many times they blame others, no matter how loudly they express their dissatisfaction, deliverance will not come from anyone else. The only person capable of breaking this destructive vicious cycle is the individual themselves. Naturally, a question arises: how can one disarm this all-consuming ego and regain full control over their own destiny? The paramount and arguably most significant step on the path to inner liberation is the profound realization that an individual is not identical to their ego. They are not the embodiment of their own suffering, nor are they defined by the baggage of past experiences, and certainly not that persistent inner voice whispering of eternal victimhood. The ego, by its very nature, seeks to bind the individual to their pain and experiences, for it is this clinging that serves as an inexhaustible source of its own existence and the maintenance of its power. However, the moment one ceases to nourish this illusory entity, the ego begins to steadily lose its grip. It gradually weakens, and it is at this pivotal moment that something truly remarkable unfolds. The process of deep inner awakening begins. There are three powerful methods that can help loosen the ego's pervasive hold on one's consciousness. 1. The first method involves the conscious observation of the inner voice that constantly reverberates in one's head. In moments when the ego insistently reminds of old emotional wounds or tries to convince one of the world's injustice, it is crucial to take a conscious pause. Instead of reacting to these mental impulses, one should simply observe this voice, adopting the position of a detached, impartial observer. It is necessary to deeply realize that this voice is not one's true essence. It is merely a mental program, an ingrained thought pattern, a kind of recording that plays over and over in the mind, sometimes without any apparent reason. The more attentively one observes this voice, without identifying with its content, the less power it gains over their inner world. 2. The second method urges one to stop feeding the story of their own suffering. Whenever one mentally replays the narrative of how they were hurt, or when they share their experiences with anyone willing to listen, they are, in essence, only strengthening that inner wound. Such actions merely give it additional energy and power. It is important to ask a key question. Does this story I constantly replay truly empower me, or does it, on the contrary, drain and weaken me? If the answer points to the latter, then it is necessary to consciously let go of this story. One should cease the endless rehearsals of their own pain, for this only perpetuates its presence. The third principle involves acting diametrically opposite to the ego's desires. The ego, by its nature, pushes the individual towards immediate reaction, aggression, holding on to grievances, and cultivating anger. However, when one responds with unperturbed calmness, with a certain detachment and complete acceptance of the situation, they effectively disarm the ego. At this moment, one's own inner strength returns. From the moment an individual clearly sees the ego in its true form, its dominance begins to steadily wane. The person ceases to feel the compulsive need to cling to pain, the necessity for external approval falls away, and identification with being a victim of unfavorable circumstances disappears. And it is in this newfound clarity that a powerful realization emerges. The true source of suffering was never rooted in the events themselves. The pain itself was undoubtedly real, but it was the story the ego skillfully built around that pain that kept the person trapped in a mental snare. Next, we turn to one of the most profound and transformative truths concerning the process of emotional healing. Pain does not disappear as a result of direct confrontation or struggle with it. On the contrary, it begins to gradually dissolve only when an individual accepts it in a completely different, unfamiliar way. This aspect is a part of the human experience that, unfortunately, no one teaches. From early childhood, people are instilled with the need to avoid pain at all costs. Common admonitions like, don't cry, be strong, don't show weakness, form behavioral patterns. As a result, the individual learns to suppress their emotions, deny their existence, or simply run away from them. However, the undeniable truth is that what one persistently resists tends to persist and even intensify. The more actively an individual tries to suppress emotional experiences, the greater power they gain over them. Suppressed pain does not dissolve without a trace. It buries itself deep within the recesses of consciousness, imprints itself in bodily sensations, and manifests in behavioral reactions. It can transform into chronic anxiety, unexplained outbursts of anger, or a state of complete emotional numbness. And the more persistently one refuses to acknowledge and experience these sensations, the deeper they become rooted in their subconscious. Carl Jung, a prominent thinker, deeply understood this truth, asserting that true enlightenment is achieved not through imagining luminous images, but through fully becoming conscious of one's own darkness. It follows that it is impossible to find healing by simply ignoring inner pain. On the contrary, every person must bravely confront their suffering, demonstrating complete honesty and relinquishing any resistance. One should perceive pain as a powerful force, a kind of internal pressure. Similar to a physical law, when one tries to suppress or push it away, this force inevitably exerts an opposing, even more powerful pressure. It is for this reason that attempts to avoid deep emotions such as sorrow, the bitterness of loss, or burning rage only intensify their impact. Often people convince themselves not to succumb to tears, not to allow themselves to feel, or not to break under the pressure of circumstances. They actively seek distractions in work, immerse themselves in the world of social media, or use any other means just to avoid solitude with their own thoughts and feelings. However, when the moment of solitude finally arrives, when the external noise subsides, inner pain returns with new, sometimes unbearable force. In such moments, one often begins to blame others or life itself, convincing themselves that the source of pain lies externally. However, as long as an individual continues to project their suffering onto the external world, they will never truly be able to look within themselves, and yet that is precisely where genuine healing begins. The essence is not that pain itself destroys us, rather, it is the resistance to it that makes suffering unbearable and all-consuming. So what is the key to breaking this destructive cycle? The answer is simple. In accepting pain, one must stop running from one's own feelings and allow oneself to experience them fully, consciously, and without any internal judgment. If sadness overwhelms someone, they should allow themselves to cry. If anger arises, it's important not to act impulsively, but also not to deny the feeling. Instead, sit with it calmly. The point is to observe the emotion, to be its witness, to feel how it moves through the body. And then something truly incredible will begin to happen. When one stops resisting pain and begins to accept it as a natural, integral human experience, it gradually loosens its suffocating grip. The monster in the mind, which seemed so enormous, begins to shrink in size, losing its power. And here, perhaps, is the deepest and most comforting truth of existence. Nothing is permanent. Every emotional state, regardless of its intensity, is transient. Every wave of sorrow will inevitably recede if an individual allows it to run its natural course. However, when one persistently resists this flow, when they cling to their narrative of pain, they unduly prolong the agony far beyond objective necessity. The healing process is not a distant prospect, it unfolds in the present moment. It is at the very instant an individual decides to stop fleeing from their own essence and fully accept themselves, including all accumulated traumas and imperfections, that genuine inner transformation begins. Renowned thinker Carl Jung extensively explored the pivotal role of inner metamorphosis, and one of the fundamental principles of this path is the realization of the inherent impermanence of existence. Neither joy nor sorrow possess an eternal nature. The entire cosmos remains in a continuous flow of change. Like fleeting pleasure, suffering is also transient. It is not a defining essence of one's personality and does not have infinite duration. One can recall previous periods of significant difficulty. In those moments, it might have seemed as though one was trapped in a storm that appeared endless. The individual might have felt hopeless, completely drained, as if there was no path to salvation. However, somehow, they managed to overcome it. Now, the individual is here, enriched with wisdom, new experiences and broadened perspectives, they successfully navigated the trial. And an identical process will occur with any kind of pain one is currently experiencing. This trial too will conclude. The storm will subside, and the sun's rays will once again illuminate the horizon. So, the question arises, how does one begin to unconditionally accept pain rather than being consumed by it? How does one free themselves from the shackles of their own suffering? There are specific methods applicable immediately. These are effective means for restoring mental equilibrium and achieving inner fortitude. 1. One must cease judging their own suffering. Avoid attaching evaluative judgments to this sensation. Do not overanalyze or dissect it. Do not ask questions like, why do these feelings arise, or when will they end? Instead, one should allow themselves to experience these feelings without any resistance, without shame, without creating verbal narratives around them. Such a state is neither good nor bad. It is merely an experience passing through the individual, and nothing more. 2. The second aspect of the method calls for observing the manifestations of pain directly in the body. When an individual experiences anxiety, outbursts of anger, deep grief, or overwhelming sorrow, they should not allow their mind to fabricate convoluted narratives about the injustice of existence or their own brokenness. Instead, it is necessary to redirect the focus of attention to bodily sensations. The individual is encouraged to ask themselves, where exactly is this emotion felt? What are its physical manifestations within the body? Perhaps it manifests as a sensation of pressure in the chest, a lump in the throat, a slight trembling of the limbs, or an unpleasant knot in the abdomen. One should simply note these sensations, observe them without attempting to fix them or engage in a struggle with them. A special approach to experiencing internal states is suggested. Instead of clenching one's jaw, clenching fists, or seeking refuge in distraction, it is recommended to try deep breathing. Take one deep breath and then another, allowing the flow of air to seemingly pass through the emotional experience. At this moment, there is no need to do anything else, no need to make the pain disappear. The sole task is to be fully present in the current moment, aware of all that is. And when one follows this principle, something amazing happens. As soon as resistance to pain ceases and it begins to be accepted with awareness, it becomes evident that it loses its power over the individual. Pain may still be present, but its grip weakens. One ceases to be a victim of circumstances and transforms into someone capable of moving through suffering with inner strength, maturity, and even grace. It is in this that true power lies, not in the desire to control or resist, but in the readiness to accept. Most people throughout their lives strive to avoid pain, distracting themselves, shying away from discomfort, finding refuge in addictions, overwork, or denial of reality. However, the only true path to liberation from suffering lies in facing it head-on, consciously and with an open heart. And when one does this, when they cease the internal struggle and allow themselves to truly feel, something miraculous occurs. They discover that pain was never their enemy. Suffering did not come to destroy them, but to awaken, shape, and transform them. As soon as this understanding arrives, fear begins to gradually dissipate. One deepens their understanding of suffering, for only by abandoning resistance to it do they gain the ability to utilize its potential. This potential unfolds not only for recovery and healing, but also for unprecedented development that previously seemed unimaginable. It is at this moment that genuine transformation originates. An individual can turn their pain into a source of great strength. Such a transformation represents a kind of alchemical process leading to profound healing. By this stage, one usually realizes that resisting suffering only exacerbates its power. The understanding that attempts to avoid pain only deepen inner wounds becomes evident, and that accepting it is the first and most crucial step towards true freedom. However, there is something even more extraordinary that can be achieved. An individual is capable of transforming their torment into their most powerful source of inner strength. Carl Jung, a distinguished thinker, grasped this truth more profoundly than anyone else. He spoke of the ancient art of alchemy not as the literal transformation of base lead into noble gold, but as a deep psychological and spiritual journey. True alchemy, in his view, unfolds within the human being. In this metaphor, lead symbolizes our pain, our deepest wounds, our hidden fears and past traumas. Gold, on the other hand, represents what one becomes when they embrace this suffering and allow it to purify them. It is wisdom, immense strength, spiritual maturity, and profound compassion. These qualities are the gifts acquired on the other side of endured adversities. Thus, the true question is not how to avoid hardships and pain. The genuine task is to turn one's own suffering into a benefit, using it as a catalyst for acquiring strength, wisdom, and inner freedom. This is where the hidden power of experienced pain lies. It serves as a kind of call to awakening, to profound realization. If one reflects on the most resilient people encountered in life, those who possess exceptional depth, insight, and radiate quiet yet unwavering courage, it becomes evident they did not achieve such qualities through a carefree life. Their development did not occur by avoiding difficulties. On the contrary, these individuals passed through the crucible of trials. Their former perceptions and foundations were shattered, and only after that were they able to be reborn, transformed. Every experience of pain represents a crossroads, a sacred invitation to choose. One is free to allow suffering to close them off from the world, or, conversely, to open them to new understanding. They can let pain define their essence, or use it for purification and rebirth. This is a fundamental choice, to abandon the old self and become someone entirely new, more awakened, more resilient, more deeply connected to life itself. Carl Jung, a distinguished thinker, once discussed the so-called dark night of the soul, a phase when an individual confronts their deepest suffering. This period is characterized by intense emotional and spiritual upheaval, when it seems to one that the foundation of their world is collapsing. There arises a feeling that the limit of one's capabilities has been reached, that the burden of existence simply becomes unbearable. Pain in these moments consumes entirely, becoming all-encompassing, even suffocating. However, Jung did not describe this critical moment as a punishment. He saw in it a sacred opportunity, an invitation to fundamental transformation, a test not so much of strength, but of readiness for evolution. For it is precisely when all seems lost, when one thinks they cannot move forward, that they are actually on the threshold of their greatest breakthrough. Imagine that instead of persistently resisting the encroaching darkness, one consciously pauses and turns their inner gaze, asking key questions. What knowledge does this trial hold? How can this pain become not a cause of collapse, but a springboard for ascent? In such a moment, something truly magnificent unfolds. The individual ceases to be a prisoner of their circumstances and begins to transform their own being like an alchemist. They embark on the process of transforming demise into renewed existence. From sorrow and ruins, a renewed aspect of the self arises, acquiring unyielding strength, perceptive wisdom, and a profound alignment with their authentic nature. Every time one has faced loss, betrayal, heartbreak, or deep disappointment, something within them has faded away. However, many do not grasp the profound essence of how this fading is an integral part of the process. It is nothing less than the demise of illusory perceptions, the conclusion of deceptive hopes, the dismantling of those facets of personality that no longer contribute to one's growth. And following each such departure is the opportunity for rebirth, a sacred chance to recreate oneself based on more fundamental truths. If an individual takes a moment to reflect on their life's journey, they will likely discover that the most significant aspects of their development were by no means the most joyful experiences. These were periods of trials and adversities, when circumstances pushed them to their very limits, and they, in some unfathomable way, unearthed inner resources to keep moving forward. This is the true essence of transformation. Raw, unmasked pain can literally tear a person apart. It methodically dismantles deeply ingrained beliefs that an individual has formed about themselves, the world around them, and other people. This powerful experience forces them to look into their reflection and confront everything that had been diligently ignored until that moment. Hidden aspects of personality, unhealed emotional wounds, those parts of their self that they had been too long afraid to acknowledge. However, it is precisely in this direct confrontation that a valuable gift lies. The opportunity to make a fundamental choice, either remain stagnant or move forward and develop, either allow suffering to definitively define one's essence or allow it to purify and transform oneself. Naturally, the question arises, how can one transform their own suffering into a source of inner strength? How can pain be given deep meaning? Below is a practical framework designed to initiate this crucial transformation. The first step in this process is a radical shift in mindset. It is essential to realize that pain is not a punitive act or punishment for anything. On the contrary, it represents a kind of initiation or rite of passage. Life does not inflict suffering upon a person with the aim of breaking their spirit or destroying their will. Instead, it presents challenges to awaken hidden reserves and potential within them. Those who perceive pain as an unjust burden often plunge into a quagmire of bitterness and remain trapped within it. However, those who accept it as an integral part of life's journey acquire unprecedented resilience and become incomparably stronger than ever before. Every encounter with difficulty, every challenge one faces, is a unique opportunity for personal growth, for acquiring new knowledge, and for comprehensive development. Therefore, instead of asking, "Why did this happen to me?" one should begin to ask, "What lesson is this meant to teach me?" 2. One must transform their personal history into a source of their strength. Consider those who, having gone through the deepest suffering, managed to transform their pain into an energy of good and creation. Those who faced rejection learned to deeply value their own essence. Individuals who experienced betrayal discovered within themselves the ability to rely on their own intuition. Those who seemed to have hit rock bottom found an unprecedented power within themselves of which they were previously unaware. Everyone's story is unique, but how it is used is entirely in their hands. 3. One should allow pain to fuel their life's purpose. Suffering can either break a person or become the driving force of their progress. The choice always remains theirs. If someone has caused pain, do not dwell on resentment. It is important to use this experience as an inner fire for ascent. When life seems unfair, one should demonstrate to the world their ability to overcome. In the case of experienced loss, one should fill the resulting void with deep meaning. The most successful individuals in the world did not achieve their heights by avoiding suffering. On the contrary, they achieved this because they managed to use their pain as a powerful springboard to their own greatness. And now comes the final, culminating stage, the transformation of pain into true wisdom. When one passes through the crucible of suffering and truly extracts valuable lessons from it, something truly amazing happens to them. They become unshakable. One ceases to react sharply to others' negativity as they realize that these projections have nothing to do with them. Pain no longer causes them fear, for they have faced it head-on and endured. In reality, one becomes stronger, wiser, more deeply rooted in their own truth. They transform into a person with an undeniable presence, someone who radiates calm and confident strength, for they have passed through the darkness and found their own inner light. The phenomenon Carl Gustav Jung termed individuation represents a sacred path to one's true essence. It is a process of liberation from imposed roles, from the fear of judgment, and from the need for external validation of one's worth. Upon reaching this stage, one discovers that the agonizing cycle of emotional suffering gradually begins to disappear. The individual ceases to identify with the sources of past traumas. Pain is no longer something to be avoided. On the contrary, it is met as a mentor, a guiding sign, foreshadowing readiness for a new phase of personal development. At this moment, a profound insight arrives. Suffering did not weaken the person, instead it forged them, making them invulnerable. From now on, the responsibility for the path forward rests with the individual, the truth becomes clear. Pain is not something to retreat from. It is a spark capable of igniting the deepest inner transformations. Two roads open before the individual, either to remain in a state of agonizing resistance, feeling like a victim of merciless circumstances, or to turn those very sufferings into a powerful springboard to rise, gain unprecedented strength, wisdom, and indomitability. Only one of these paths can bestow true liberation. Thus a fateful choice stands before each person. As Jung aptly noted, you cannot wake up until you hit bottom. By recognizing this fundamental truth about the nature of suffering, one gains boundless power to transform their own life. Pain retains its dominant power only as long as it is persistently resisted. However, as soon as one stops shying away from it and begins to perceive it as the greatest teacher, everything around them instantly transforms. The individual then becomes the true master of their destiny, not its helpless victim.